Hello, and welcome to Module 8. I hope you guys are all holding up real well. If you have any concerns or problems that is slowing down your work, feel free to contact me and I will try to work with you to help you get through everything. Well, in any case, today we're going to talk about Module 8, which is Welfare Economics. I would say we've reached the point in the semester where you really don't need to learn more material in order to start putting together your final paper. However, all along we're going to be picking up little bits more of information that will help your paper become much stronger. And I think an understanding of welfare economics is very useful for most of your papers because a lot of you are writing papers that are designed to utilize people's incentives in order to better their lives. Well, also though, this section should give you an idea on some of the limitations that you'll have. Now first, we do part 4 of Bardock and the Appendix A. And I think part 4 of Bardock, has some interesting information telling you to, look beneath the surface, but to also try to find the practices that have worked in other places and have been useful and successful. So I recommend that you read through that, but I highly recommend that you look at Appendix A. Appendix A is primarily a list of all the different activities, types of policies that government might undertake. And so when you're building your paper and you're building the alternatives, you might want to speak in the language that Bardock uses for these different governmental activities. The government, after all, is a institution full of people who are familiar with certain language and jargon and terminology. And so to whatever degree you can take what you've already been doing and utilize the terminology that would be understandable to a policy professional, the more professional you will seem. And so I would look through that. It has a nice section, talks about taxes and talks about everything from the government educating the public about important concerns that they have, all the way to structuring and organizing business activity. Now, the welfare economics paradigm focuses a great deal on structuring economic activity in order to create outcomes that are desirable socially, or at least socially desirable as determined by the people who make those decisions within a society. I think that, after reading the Stone book as you have, that you all have a really good idea on the limitations of unanimity within a society, that not everybody thinks alike, and that there's actually a bit of a struggle, ideally below the surface, but quite often above the surface, for what the meaning of good. So when we look at the Jeremy Bentham quote that says that the goal of welfare economics is to seek the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that you're going to realize that, what's good? Good might be the ability to, sit on your front porch and while away the hours in a stupor and never understand what's going on and what you're facing. That might be something that a certain group of people would want. Well, is their good legitimate? Well, what about somebody else who says, well, it might not feel good, but if I can do something that in the long term will better my life, should I get the benefit of that? Actually, welfare economics typically talks about trying to maximize the benefits in terms of sort of a middle class view of what better off would be. And so if you want, you can challenge that at the margins. But another thing to keep in mind is that if you're creating a governmental program that a great majority of the people are going to be working against its success, then you're not going to get the multiplicative advantages of creating a government program that most people, through their own optimization efforts, will carry out. Either you can either force the people to do what they don't want, or you can encourage the people to do what they do want. But in either case, you have to realize that you might get more or less of what you desire based on that. Now, the welfare economics paradigm is based at first on a couple key concepts. First, we would say it is not a descriptive view of economics. In fact, it is a look at the economy and the way it should be, what the economy should do in order to produce the outcomes that we desire. I say that it's normative and it's prescriptive. So normative in the case of it takes a side as to the outcome it wants, and prescriptive, it describes what you're going to want to do in order to achieve it. Benham said it seeks the greatest good for the greatest number. Munger, though, and probably the reason why we're interested in this is Munger says that this is the first step that we should take into account if we want to do policy analysis. How are we going to create the greatest good for the most people? Sometimes that's not even, I guess, what some of us are trying to do, right? Some of us are trying to give minimal services to people who aren't even getting that. But you can conceptualize that as increasing the number of people who live a satisfactory life or get things necessary in order to live a satisfactory life. So most of us are going to be engaged in welfare economics, and because of that, that's why we learn this in this section of the course. So welfare economics has two underlying theorems that are useful for us all to know. So in the sense that it's a theorem, it means it's been proven. You can look up somebody actually proposed it, they tested it, and as such, it's generally accepted to be true. Now, also as such, it's somewhat vague. The first theorem of welfare economics is that all general equilibria, and this means Pareto equilibria, in a perfectly competitive market are Pareto optimal. I'm sorry. All general equilibria in perfectly competitive markets are Pareto optimal. This means that if you reach an equilibrium, if you reach a status quo, if you reach an outcome that is stable, then it's going to be one of the Pareto optimal outcomes. And what's a Pareto optimal outcome again? It's an outcome where any change that you make from that status, from that equilibrium, will harm at least one person, and usually more. And so what are we trying to do when we try to avoid making changes? Well, Pareto placed a great deal of priority on saying that every single person's well-being was equally important to the well-being of the group. Now, we aren't always able to reach that, but that does something very powerful for us. That tells us that we are going to have to alter the outcome in a negative way for somebody to achieve any change. If you, now you might be able to make an argument that you do not have a perfectly competitive market. A couple of the key components of a perfectly competitive market are, one, perfect information. And so so there might be there might be a product that you really want that's you know, 3 streets over, and when you get to the market, you see that they're selling it for $6, and if you knew that you could go 3 blocks and get it for $3, you would always go to that other one. And because the person at your market knew that, they would have to lower their price at least enough to make it not worth your while to go an extra 3 blocks. But you don't know. So you might go and you might purchase from the first person you see with a product. And that happens a lot. You know, the information age and technology has improved that, but it still exists that we're not all perfectly aware of everything that's going on. Now, another key component is that you don't have monopolies. So if in a perfectly competitive market, both the producer and the consumer are price takers, meaning that they are stuck with whatever price the market would bear. And we know that that's not perfectly true either. But again, it's often quite similar to the truth. You know, even things like cable television, you can switch, you can cut the cord, and you can find ways to get, you know, the same programs for less money. Well, that should do one of two things. It will either eventually get rid of cable, as a lot of people are predicting, or it will cause those prices to go down. And you see that oftentimes they will try to, you know, grab you with a low initial offer because they know that if they make it too difficult, you're just going to go another place. The second welfare theorem is that these equilibria, these general equilibriums exist, and any desired one of them can be attained through the proper initial division of productive resources, followed by the optimizing behavior of citizens. Now, citizens is used broadly, right? We don't just mean people who are citizens, we mean people who happen to live, we should say residents, right? Well, in any case, what we're saying is, even though I've challenged you with 2 possible reasons why we shouldn't expect there to be competitive markets, there are enough of that assumption exists that there do exist general equilibria. And any one of them can be attained through a proper initial division of resources. Now, I think a lot of you would argue that resources certainly they're not equally divided, but that's not what this is saying. This is not saying that the resources would be equally divided. Instead, it's saying that there's people that you could get the resources to that would provide some particular equilibrium outcome. It might be in your best interest, for instance, to give more fuel and raw materials to somebody who's going to build a home than somebody who is going to build a tent. Because the person who's going to just live in a tent is going to stack those resources in his backyard and just leave them to rot. Whereas the person who's building a home might use them to, you know, to build a house. And in fact, if he has leftover ones, he'll have the ability, the talent, to go and then build another house. Certainly that there's people in this world, right, who we'd say, Carl, you should give them all of the nails and wood beams and stuff that you have in your backyard, because you'll never build a decent house, but they could do a lot of good with it. Now, the rest of what we look at in the 2-slide presentations about welfare economics talk about first the different ways that resources can be distributed, ideas like the demand curve and the indifference curve and how they're related, all of which might help you as you're trying to write your paper. And there's a section on what could be called regulatory form, or the idea of markets versus experts versus politics, or sort of the idea of equity. So equity and efficiency and regulation are all part of that second slide presentation that I think you should look at just for your information. So again, most of this is designed as informational as you're trying to build your paper. Reaction paper number 6 actually covers not any of this material, but helps me by making you give me an update on how your paper's going. I strongly recommend that you get started in gaming out what your paper should look like. I would recommend that you consider structuring your paper much the way you look at the stages of the policy process or the steps in policy analysis. Maybe that's a choice you can make, but certainly, you're going to want to start by describing the problem. Then you're going to want to move to describing alternatives that have been suggested, maybe even alternatives that you have considered. Then your criteria for what would be success. And then your next step should be for you to look at actually making the decision. And then finally, how you would plan to implement it. And implementation often carries with it the ideas of what's politically feasible, what's technologically feasible. I think that, quite often you have these focusing events where you realize that not everything that you would do if you could is technologically feasible. And then finally, if you were to look at the stages of policy analysis, you might want to talk a little bit about how you're going to get your idea on the public agenda. You're certainly going to want to talk about how you're going to want to implement this policy, who the policy makers are, who the stakeholders are. Anything that you can bring into the paper from those ideas will make it seem much stronger. It might help you a good deal as you finish. But certainly having all of the material together, having some of your content written, this might be something you might want to do over the next couple weeks as we consider this section of the course. Also, you have 2 videos to watch. The Mark Blog video on the fundamental theorems of welfare economics historically contemplated. It's very good. Maybe you decide you don't have the time to watch it. That's sad, but all things considered. But I would recommend that you keep it for when you do have a chance. It will certainly help you understand this intersection of politics and economics. And then John Maynard Keynes' video, and probably not the creator of welfare economics, but definitely one of the top proponents of the idea of using economics to help the average citizen and to fix, the problems, of market failure in politics during the time of the Great Depression. So a lot of material there. And I wish you all well. If there's anything at all that I can do to help you during these next couple weeks, especially as it relates to school, feel free to contact me. I'll do my best. Thank you.